Well, we've got our next presenter, actually are three presenters, and we're looking forward to hearing from them. And I'm going to turn the the control over to Zach here in just a bit, but let's do just a mic test and make sure that we got our folks queued up and ready to go. Christy, Kate, and Zach, are you with us today?
Yep, I'm here.
There you are.
Yep, I'm
I'm here as well.
Doing great. You know, Zach and I practiced this the other day, and I think I was going to give control over to him, but would you like the control to go to someone else, or is Zach going to be all right?
Zach is welcome to do the technical work.
The technical work. Okay. Let me introduce you then. And the subject is combining flood damage reduction and ecosystem services benefits for dam projects. We've got Christi Fisher with us today from the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service North Dakota State Conservation Engineer. And we also have Kate or Catherine Sharpe with us today, our senior economist from, I'll say this correctly, I hope, Gannett Fleming, is that right?
That works.
Gannett Fleming. And Zach Hermann is with us today, project manager, Houston Engineering Incorporated. Can't be more excited about hearing the topic that you're going to be talking about today. So Zach, let's do a bit of a test, see if you're controlling the machine there. All right, you are.
All right.
Airway.
Okay, I'll start us off here. Thanks for the invitation to present today. And I'll just share, back in 2015, the Red River Retention Authority was approved for a $12 million RCPP project to complete 20 watershed plans in North Dakota and Minnesota. And we talked a little bit about RCPP earlier today. And really the way we approached it was there was no difference between an RCPP funded watershed plan or a watershed ops funded watershed plan other than the funding source. We really tried to take the same approach. That said, in 2015, I was a brand new state engineer, as was the state engineer in Minnesota. And when my state conservationist, Mary Podol, asked me to head up the in North Dakota RCPP watershed plans and make sure they were a success, I said, sure, great, no problem. And I went back to my office to Google what the heck a watershed plan was. So we did not have expertise in the state, along with many states, and we started a whole lot of plans at once. So 5 years later, with a lot of help from the national headquarters staff and the National Water Management Center, we are getting there on quite a number of these plans. And so we're just going to share today what we've learned along the way, and hopefully some of that will be useful to you. Zach. So what we'll go over today is just sort of the background, how we started these 20 watershed plans and why, what the issues were. The sort of monetized benefits we looked at in terms of flood damage reduction for the projects, the non-monetized benefits that we worked on for water quality and wildlife habitat, and then how we see moving forward with these plans in the Red River Basin and PL 566 in general. So I'm going to turn things over to Zach with Houston Engineering now, and he has a longer history of working on the Red River flooding issues actually than I do. Just a side note on these plans, because it's RCPP and they were partnership efforts, the local sponsors funded 30% of the planning efforts and NRCS about 70%. So our sponsors, by and large, had consulting firms on long-term retainers with them. And those firms had a lot of detailed knowledge of flooding and drainage issues in the counties, and the sponsors wanted to continue to use their consulting firms. So we really had a good partnership with those local consulting firms and NRCS throughout the process, and Zach was one of those.
All right, well, thank you, Christy. As Ray mentioned, my name is Zach Hermann. I'm with Houston Engineering. We are not affiliated at all with Houston, Texas. We get that quite a bit. We're actually headquartered out of Fargo, North Dakota, which is right about in the center of the map that you see on the screen here. So like Christy mentioned, I've been working on flooding issues in the Red River Basin really for the majority of my career. So albeit not specific to PL 566, I've got quite a bit of background, I guess, just working with flooding issues within the Red River Basin. So we wanted to kind of start out here by just setting the stage, kind of explaining where the Red River Basin is, what some of the issues are that exist, and then we'll kind of move into the detail of how we attacked the watershed planning that was completed through the RCPP grant. So just to get started, the Red River Basin, located in north central United States, kind of split between North Dakota and Minnesota, small portion in South Dakota. It actually flows from south to north across an international boundary into Manitoba, Canada, and from there it outlets into Lake Winnipeg. We do have some of the flattest topography in the world actually up in our area, and a lot of that's driven from a majority of the basin resides at the bottom of a historic lake plain. And what that did is as the glaciers receded during the last ice age, it left kind of very flat topography, deposited a lot of heavier soils and things like that. And all that's kind of led to kind of a very flood prone landscape. And, you know, many of you maybe have heard about some of the floods we've had, some of the more severe floods in the springtime when we've had community risks along the Red River and things like that. We certainly have those events during the spring. We also have quite a bit of kind of localized summer flooding due to rainfall, which we'll get into. Kind of the backbone of our economy up here is agriculture. It was really what drives a lot of the economies of the small and large urban centers, I guess, within the Red River Basin. So protection of agriculture from flood damages is a big focus of what we did through the RCPP program. Just like everywhere, we're dealing with much higher volumes of water than what we've seen historically. In terms of overall annual discharge, we're seeing that increase quite a bit, up to 3 times as much through the last century. When looking at where that's coming from, we've got kind of a whole bunch of different issues on the landscape. Like was mentioned earlier today, we've seen precipitation increase quite a bit. Also, you know, we've had some land use changes across the watershed as well related to agriculture, drainage, and things of that nature. So just some of those issues, I'll quickly go through some slides here to show kind of some of the flooding issues that we deal with in the Red River Basin. So, you know, in the springtime, we are far enough north that we do develop a pretty long lasting snowpack that continues to build through the winter, tends to let loose in fairly rapid fashion as soon as we get warm weather in late March and early April. What that does is it leads to, under certain circumstances, pretty severe spring flooding along the Red River main stem. Some of the pictures you see on here depict some of the typical damages that we experience during spring floods. So infrastructure damages, threats to private property and rural residences, as well as you can kind of see the photo in the upper right. That's actually the city of Grand Forks from the 1997 flood, which up until recently, I guess, was the flood of record that resulted in the community of Grand Forks, which was about 60,000 residents experiencing pretty massive flood damages. A fire broke out during the flood and actually burned a substantial part of the downtown district in Grand Forks. So also, you know, again, with the flat topography, I think that kind of shows itself in the bottom right picture where you just see the expansive floodplain when we do get up out of our riverbanks during flood situations. Another thing that happens throughout the Red River Basin is we do have frequent, more isolated flooding during severe rainfall events. This leads to all types of issues related to agricultural damages, inundation of cropland. You know, when we get kind of out away from that historic lake plain, we do have moderate to steep landscape slopes that leads to pretty massive overland erosion when we have large enough floods that flows are actually leaving the channels and kind of just move overland section by section, kind of downstream essentially. And when the water recedes, we're left with pretty massive erosion that needs to be fixed. So these are the type of issues that we were looking to resolve through the RCPP process, I guess, when we're talking about flood damages. So what happened related to flooding within the Red Basin was there was a group that was formed called the Red River Basin Commission. What they developed was some recommendations, kind of working collaboratively between the two countries, the states, and the multiple local government units to develop flood damage reduction objectives for the Red Basin. So those objectives were associated with risks. So for example, ag land was determined that it was desirable to provide flood protection up to a 10-year level versus larger communities maybe had a larger recommendation, for example. Another thing that came out of that was strategies to attain those objectives. And that's from a flooding perspective, that's been referred to as the basin-wide flow reduction strategy. Kind of the whole, the concept there was, you know, can we reduce tributary outflows? So across the entire Red River Basin, can we reduce tributary outflows to address some of those localized issues? And if we can do that, can we have a cumulative net effect to reduce the peak peak discharge on the Red River itself by 20%? So that kind of sets the stage, I guess, from a flood damage reduction standpoint. what led to the RCPP was, from a local perspective, was to pursue this this basin-wide flow reduction strategy across the Red River Basin. So there's a lot of other issues within the Red River Basin that exist, not just related to flooding. So as we mentioned, the Red River Basin outlets into Lake Winnipeg, you can see highlighted on the map. That's actually the 11th largest freshwater lake in the world. It's critical to the First Nations tribe in Canada, very large value in recreational and commercial fishing. One of the issues that we see with the lake is that there's a large amount of phosphorus loading going on into the lake. You can see about 7,900 tons per year loading, only about 2,400 tons per year leaving. So that means a lot of that phosphorus is remaining trapped within Lake Winnipeg. That's resulted in essentially eutrophication occurring within Lake Winnipeg itself, kind of changing the water chemistry of the lake. We see massive algal blooms within the lake, and it's beginning to have a negative effect on those commercial and recreational fisheries that exist within the lake itself. Something that's kind of interesting is the Red River Basin has been shown to contribute nearly 69% of the phosphorus load, while only constituting about 11% of the total watershed to Lake Winnipeg. So what that led to was through the IJC, or the International Joint Commission, was an internationally agreed to objective to reduce phosphorus concentrations at the international border on the Red River main stem itself. Another piece of the Red River Basin is we actually are a portion of the Prairie Pothole region in the north central United States, south central Canada. This area is critically important to breeding waterfowl. Nearly 50 to 80% of North American ducks actually breed within this area. Critical to other migratory birds and shorebirds, things of that nature. The amount of production that this landscape is capable of is really tied closely to how much and what the quality is of that habitat. Things certainly have changed that landscape within the Red Basin because of the large agricultural industry that we have within the basin. Things like intensive artificial drainage to support row crop production, things like that have really kind of altered the landscape, kind of left certain areas with kind of fragmented habitat, some reduced quality with those areas as well. So when we combine the flood damage reduction along with the water quality and habitat concerns within the Red River Basin, what that led to was, as Christi mentioned, the start of watershed planning through the RCPP program on 22 individual small watersheds across the basin. So, you know, there's been quite a bit of organization within the Red River Basin of local water management authorities. So we have watershed districts on the Minnesota side, essentially, that manage water on a watershed basis, and then county water resource districts on the North Dakota side. They worked to form the Red River Retention Authority, who actually worked with NRCS to secure the $12 million in funding to move through the watershed planning process, essentially. And as Christi mentioned, you know, we've had some success with a few of the watersheds now as we're kind of getting to completion. And what we're going to do is just kind of talk through what we've done on a couple of these, and essentially lessons, you know, things that we've learned through the way that maybe can help out other project sponsors as they go forward with planning on watershed operations projects. So the first thing I'm just going to touch on real quick, and I'll turn it over to Kate to kind of talk through how we handled economics. But I just want to talk through how we kind of inventory where those damages are in the landscape. So the first thing that we do is identify, is there a demonstrated need? So that generally involves working with individual producers, public meetings, the project sponsors, identify where those issues exist and to what extent those issues exist within the landscape. From there, we kind of go into more of a technical analysis to inventory where those problems are actually happening. So that's, you know, from a flood perspective, that's kind of your hydrology and hydraulics review, that step. And then ultimately, what Kate will talk about is, once we have that inventory where the problems are on the landscape, they're then monetized to determine, you know, what type of damages exist out there. So from determining where those problems exist, kind of the goal there is identify where and the magnitude of the flood damages. So some of these pictures you saw on the previous slide, but this is a large late spring rainfall event that happened in one of watersheds that we did PL 566 planning in. What this shows is pretty extensive flooding that occurred during a large rainfall event. This happened on a right during spring planting, so kind of on a prepped seed bed. What that did was there was a lot of crop damage that was resultant, and then also we had quite a bit of erosion that occurred in the landscape. So what we did with that was, after that event, that kind of spurred a local planning effort where we went through a public process to solicit input on where those issues exist in the landscape. So we conducted several public meetings, provided comment forms to individuals, provided a map, asked them to indicate on the map kind of where they reside, what type of issues they see. We then were able to take kind of their comments and spatially reference them, which was helpful for then conveying that back to the sponsor as well as to the public itself to help define where those issues exist in the landscape. So from there, we take that information and we kind of do a little more detailed look in terms of where the flood damages occur. So this is where we try and assess, develop an inventory of where the flooding occurs and what the risk is of the flooding occurring at those locations. So we look at what's the frequency. So, you know, how often does the flooding occur? 1 out of every X amount of years. Where does it occur? So what are the extents of the flooding? To what depth does it occur? And how long does it actually stay in the landscape, or what's the duration? And then, you know, since we are talking crop damages, it's also very important within the growing season, when do those floods occur? So, you know, when we talk about frequency, we've got a lot of information available to us. Our projects were focused mainly on crop damages. So, you know, we looked at things like rainfall depths, and there's a lot of good source data out there for that. We rely on the NOAA Atlas 14 information. You know, we are in a watershed where spring flooding or snowmelt flooding also drives significant damages. Those aren't quite as important during when we're talking about agricultural damages, but you know, if we were focused on community damages or something like that, we maybe would take another look at how we assess that frequency. Then the next step is where, the depth, and the duration. So this is kind of where the modeling comes in, and we won't dive into too many of the details of the modeling, but just to give you an idea, essentially, once we have those events, what we do is we take those rainfall events, we run them through a hydrology model that tells us information about the duration of flooding relative to flow rates. And then we take that information and put it into a hydraulics model, which then gives us information about the duration of flooding relative to the depth. So what that does then is, when we get through all those steps, we have those required characteristics, or essentially kind of an inventory of flood risk on the landscape that we can then provide to an economist to monetize what those damages are. So I'll just quickly go through this to kind of give you an idea. Hopefully this plays. This kind of shows just an example of the type of information that you get out of the model. So again, what this gives you is an inventory of where the flooding occurs, to what extent it occurs, the time that it occurs, how long is it on a particular field, for example, and to what depth does the flooding actually get. So this is the inventory of flooding information that we can get, and then essentially provide on to an economist to monetize those damages. And kind of the last piece there is we have to assess, once we know kind of where the flooding occurs and what the extent of the flooding is, you know, when we're talking about crop damages, it's pretty critical to know what time of year those floods happen. So, you know, is it springtime on either a prepared seed bed, or when crops are just beginning to grow? Is it summer when we've got kind of peak crop development going on? Or is it during the fall when we have kind of gearing up and in the middle of harvest operations? So we took a look at kind of when the rainfall occurred that was used to develop the frequency information from Atlas 14 and develop this seasonal distribution. What this shows, maybe not surprisingly for our climate in North Dakota, is that, you know, we've got the most energy available for rainfall kind of in the May through August timeframe, with that tapering off more in the you know, when we get into our cooler weather season, essentially. So again, if we were looking at this from a standpoint of trying to model springtime floods, this distribution would look quite a bit different. But because we're looking at damages to cropland and we're analyzing rainfall, this is the seasonal distribution that then is kind of developed. So when we have all those variables put together, what we do is we take that information that's kind of put together and helps define where the flooding occurs. And from there, that's where we kind of get into monetizing those damages. So, we really follow that same process once we do identify alternatives on the landscape. So, so what that does is we'll have damages with the project and without the project. And that's kind of how we get to the benefit cost ratio. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate just to talk through how we actually monetize what those damages are.
Right. We're right here at a great spot, Kate, right before you start, and I can change the remote control over to you if you want. Do you have several slides you want to do?
Sure. Thanks.
Okay. Let me do that. And let's tackle a question, Zach, while I'm doing that. Did you consider the extended flood damage in the basin from rain on snow events?
Through the RCPP effort, we did not get into that level of detail because a lot of our damages were focused on, we're looking at kind of more of those smaller localized watersheds further up within the basin. So most of the damages on the ag land were driven more so on the on the rainfall events, but that is something, from a dam safety perspective that is being evaluated, is looking at, from like a PMP perspective, what does rain on snow mean for severe flooding? So it wasn't analyzed in this, but it's something that has been considered when we're looking kind of more at kind of those larger floods on the red main stem, particularly when we're talking about protecting communities, like Fargo Moorhead or the city of Grand Forks. So
yeah. And it seems like a timely question here too, Kate, before you go on. Did you use the HEC WAT to do all of those models for the economics? Oh, economics are coming up. So maybe we'll hold that one. Let's hold that one until Kate keeps going. All right, Kate, let's see if you got the control. Is it working for you?
Okay.
Yep.
Let's see. Well, if I go forward, am I going to be able to go back?
Yeah, use your arrow keys. Usually works really good for you. There you go.
Oh yeah, look at that. All right.
Is that cool?
All right. Well, thanks, Ray, and thanks, Zach. I'm going to talk about how we completed the benefit cost analysis for one of these RCPP projects. I'm going to talk about North Branch Park River. We'll talk about how we documented that as part of our watershed plan EA as well. And Ray, I'll just have to take a minute. I feel like I have to put in just a quick shout out for economists. We've been talking kind of a surprising amount the last couple of days about economics and economists, at least surprising to me. So I just felt like I had to say we are out here doing this watershed planning work. Some of us are under 80. I don't know if that's an advantage or a disadvantage. But we are out here. I'm on the consultant side, as Christi said, but NRCS is definitely looking to fill new economist positions as well. I know they've just hired in Arizona, and they're definitely looking at adding support, in that area. So just a quick status on economists. We are out here. But anyway, back to North Branch. So when you're looking at benefit cost analysis, whether you're talking about new flood control structures or whether you're talking about rehabilitating older structures, the goal is always to have the benefits of flood protection be greater than the cost of the project. So as Zach was explaining, we looked at flood events with different recurrence intervals. And for North Branch Park, the largest event that we looked at was the 500-year under existing conditions. So once we had that as like an outer boundary of our study area, we collected county tax parcel data to identify structures that would be affected by the flooding. And then we also collected GIS data on the roads and bridges and railroads that are in the flooded area. And so once we knew what structures were downstream, we needed to estimate a value for the different structures. One option for doing this in watershed planning is to use tax data, to use assessed value from tax data. And sometimes that works well, and other times it's not really a great option. It wasn't such a great option here. Sometimes it's not like you just don't have a value. here in North Branch Park, we had a school in the floodplain. And because school buildings aren't really taxed the way that other structures might be taxed, there's not really a good value that's present there in the tax data. And then a lot of times too, if you're using assessed value, it doesn't really represent what it would cost to replace the building if it were flooded. So we use Marshall and Swift. It's a commercial cost database. It's a really useful tool. It has replacement values for just about every kind of structure that you can imagine. In the image here, I have potato storage buildings, which we had a lot of on North Branch Park. And then when you're looking at flood damages, you know, of course, it's not just the value of the structure itself, but it's the value of the contents. Oops, went too far. Thanks. Or, you know, what's inside the building that's going to cause damage. And for residential properties, that's a pretty straightforward calculation. But when you have agricultural buildings, it was really more important for us to understand a lot more about the specific contents that were inside these buildings. So to do that, we conducted written interviews with the Pembina County and the Walsh County Water Resource Districts. And we asked them a whole bunch of questions. We asked about, you know, the specialized equipment that they might have inside these buildings. We asked them unusual questions like, what's the bushel capacity for this size storage building for potatoes? You know, and we were also working with published data, but those interviews really helped us confirm that our assumptions were correct and they were accurate for the study area. Whoops, there we go. And then on the agricultural side, for the agricultural land, we use USDA's GIS cropland data layer that shows the dominant crops in the study area. And we were working in, you know, this is eastern North Dakota, so you have a lot of corn and soybean, you have a lot of wheat and dry beans. There's some specialized crop there. Potatoes and sugar beets are two specialized crops. And we actually analyzed 5 years worth of this data because NRCS wanted to account for crop rotations that occur in different years. And also just sort of one-off events, like maybe 1 year your sugar beet processing plant is offline and you plant fewer beets that year, stuff like that. So looking at those multiple years just helps us account for those year-to-year differences. And then we also collect USDA data. They have crop yields per county and normalized prices, 5-year average prices. So once we collect all of this data, and I think, Ray, this will answer the question, we use the Army Corps of Engineers HEC FIA model to estimate flood damages for each event. This model is one that we like, and it has the National Water Management Center stamp of approval. So that's important for watershed planning. But there are definitely other good models out there. HEC FDA is one that's used a lot. FEMA has this. So there are other models that will do this work as well. But we looked at 8 different flood events. There's not really a firm number on how many flood events you need to include. You just want to select a range that's going to capture, you know, most of the effects to the study area. And then the way we measure benefits is by comparing existing conditions against the alternative that we want to implement, right? And seeing how much flood damage reduction is going to result. The images here are just some study area properties, and you can see our output from the model. We made some assumptions about personal vehicles and what would be there in the floodplain, and then you can see just some of the other damages that are there. And similarly, then on the infrastructure side, we overlaid the flood boundaries on the downstream infrastructure GIS. And then we used our civil engineers to estimate per linear foot replacement costs for some representative roadway types that are up there on the screen. We made some assumptions, you know, based on the velocity and the depth of flooding about what % of flooded roadways are going to be damaged, what % might wash out entirely. And then again, we look at the difference in damages between existing and the proposed alternative. So to look at avoiding flood damages to crops, we use a combination of the HEC-FIA model and a spreadsheet model that our team has developed for these type of projects in agricultural watersheds. So first we put the crop data into HEC-FIA, and that gives us acres flooded for each crop. That tells us how long the crop is underwater. I think as Zach was mentioning, crops are really different than, say, a house, which is kind of binary. It's either flooded or not flooded. But some crops can actually be flooded for a short duration of time and they can be more or less okay. And then other crops, not so much. So duration is really important in this type of analysis. And then we convert the flooded acres into monetary damages, and that's based on that crop price and acre yield data. So just looking a little bit deeper at what we considered when we were measuring crop damage, as Zach talked about, we looked at the seasonal flood distribution and the flood duration. We also look at late planting. So if you have a spring flood and it results in late planting, then you're probably going to have a yield loss on the season. And same idea, if you need to replant, there's going to be a cost associated with that. We also looked at the cost of additional land treatment after a flood. If you have to go back over the soil to prepare it for planting after a flood, there's an additional cost associated with that as well. We look at, if you had a flood in the middle of the growing season, how does that affect crop yield? It'll reduce your yield on the season. We consider crops in storage bins, that are there in the floodplain, like are they full or not full, or, you have to make some assumptions about that. And then it's also important what we don't put in the model. So we definitely have some excluded costs. We don't include crop insurance payments because those are really just a transfer from an insurer to an affected producer. We don't include sunk costs either. So, that would be like money you can't get back, if the purchase of a tractor is an example, something like that. And then other costs that are incurred regardless of whether there's a flood, such as a mortgage payment and stuff. Those are all things that we exclude from the model. So that's a lot of detail, I guess, on the crop side of the modeling. But basically, we put all that information together, and for North Branch Park, we came up with an average annual flood damage reduction benefit over our project life, and that which was 50 years. And so after we had done all this work, we kind of looked at the number and we were like, this is good, but we know that we have a lot more benefits than what we're showing here on paper. As Zach was talking about, some of the other benefits were water quality and habitat benefits, as well as contributing to regional flood management. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Christi, and she's going to talk in more detail about how we documented those benefits for North Branch Park and how that was really critical when it came to moving this project forward.
And Christi, you should be able to wiggle your mouse and take control of the machine.
Okay.
All right.
It works amazingly seamlessly. I like it. So thanks. I hope what you've all picked up so far is that we put a ton of effort into sophisticated modeling and detailed accounting of crop losses and other flood damages in the watershed, as Kate described. Unfortunately, I'm not going forward, am I? There we go. Anyway, unfortunately, the results of all that work, and we'll continue on with this example of North Branch Park for now, was that, it really didn't look like we had a valuable flood damage reduction project. Oh, dang it, now I went too far. There we go. So if we looked at our sort of that annual construction cost and annual O&M costs of our proposed retention project, we were looking at an average annual cost of $364,000. And as Kate showed, we only had monetized benefits of $197,000. So for a benefit cost ratio of a 0.5. So following the watershed planning process through P&G at that time, our NED alternative was to take no action. And you can guess that didn't necessarily go over well with our sponsors of the RCPP project or our local project sponsors. They came back to us, first thought that, well, the economists must be missing something. We must not be picking up all the data. So we kind of went around and around on that. We asked ourselves questions like, we have a lot of pre-1970 PL 566 projects in North Dakota. Why do the economics today look so different than they did back then? Is the fact that we're using this more sophisticated modeling approach kind of penalizing us? Are all the good flood projects already built? Are these just not good projects that we're looking at? Because this happened with every one of our retention projects in the Red River Basin that we analyzed. None of them would cost benefit out in terms of the retention projects. Or is that the construction costs have really outpaced the crop values over time? And a lot of farmers might tell you something to that effect makes sense. But in the end, we continued on, and I think we ended up with probably better projects in terms of meeting some of the other goals of the RCPP project. So Zach talked a little bit about the water quality issues in Lake Winnipeg and the concerns with phosphorus. If to some extent you might say, well, is that because we've just been in this very wet cycle and we have all this additional runoff occurring? Is that what's delivering all the phosphorus? On the graph there, you can see that USGS did a flow average trend of total phosphorus at the international border crossing. And that wasn't the case when you take out the effects of flow and you just look at phosphorus concentrations from 2000 to 2015, we still have an increase of 26%. So that red line down at the bottom is that 0.15 milligram per liter that we've negotiated between the countries under that treaty. And you can see it's going to take an awful lot of work to reverse that trend and to try to get us down below that red dashed line. So a project that could accomplish that would obviously be desirable. And that 5,000 mile border we had with Canada, interestingly, ever since 1909, we've had a treaty governing the disputes about water. And right in that original treaty was a statement that boundary waters flowing across the border shall not be polluted to the injury of the other. So obviously Canada causes some pollution and moves some problems down to the United States and vice versa, but we have a dispute mediation function through the International Joint Commission that works on those issues. So that was one of the things we wanted to look at. So the next question you might ask is, well, is PL56 even really the right program to address that phosphorus issue on the Red River? It's a very well-studied basin at this point, given the issues in Lake Winnipeg, and depending on which study you read, the U.S. is responsible to 68 to 76%. Less than 5% of that is from point sources. It's where most of North Dakota's population is, but yet it's not a very populated basin, so wastewater treatment plants don't make up a huge part of it. There's some natural contributions from forests and wetlands, but the majority is coming from cropland and agricultural non-point source pollution. So that would tell you that USDA makes sense as an entity to try to work on this problem. In terms of whether PL 566 is the right issue, you'd say, well, because there are good conservation practices like conservation tillage and cover crops and vegetative buffers, riparian buffers. Yeah, shouldn't EQIP and CSP maybe be used to solve the problem here and not PL 566? Well, in this particular watershed, because it's such a flat watershed, we're looking at about 1 foot per mile on the main channel and a wide floodplain of about 100 miles. We have these really long time periods for water, soil, and plant residue interactions in fine-grained soils. So as these long duration flood events spread out across these big acreages in the spring, when the ground is frozen or partially frozen, there's a long period of time when phosphorus can dissolve essentially from soils and dead vegetation into the water column, which then routes back to the river as the flood recedes. And we see that in the water quality monitoring. It's really on the receding limb of the hydrograph that you get the peak of phosphorus concentrations. And I won't take you back to your organic chemistry class, but basically the phosphorus cycle does involve this sort of constant movement of phosphorus into vegetation and microorganisms in the soil. And then that dissolved phosphorus is exchanged between the water and the soil and those living organisms. So, and then on top of that, we as ag producers add significant volumes of inorganic phosphorus to crop fields that's also available for dissolution. So in one sense, any flood control project in this landscape that limits the acreage of cropland that's inundated has a water quality benefit. So on-farm conservation practices like vegetated filter strips or field buffers, like are shown in these diagrams, they work in a lot of the parts of the country really well because they trap phosphorus as they trap sediment particles. In this landscape where phosphorus is moving in dissolved form, that doesn't work so well. The infiltration capacity in the growing season when that ground isn't frozen does provide a benefit. So during the summer, those types of practices can have a benefit. On the other hand, in the non-growing season, so during spring runoff events, all that additional organic material and dead vegetation on the ground actually contributes more phosphorus to the river than would have been there otherwise. So as a result, the research in this basin shows as much as a 500% increase in phosphorus when you put vegetated filter strips along a crop field, or in some cases a 40% reduction, just sort of depending on the timing of runoff events, essentially. So, and they found the same, not going through it all, whether you're talking about no-till or cover crops, basically any type of practice that adds organic matter, those conservation practices do many good things, but they don't serve to reduce phosphorus. In fact, they oftentimes increase it. So we're trading one conservation benefit for another. So what can we do? This is about the only proven method in this basin of reducing phosphorus. It's been used extensively in Manitoba and one project in Minnesota. And it basically works on that theory I was talking about with the phosphorus cycle, that growing vegetation, in this case cattails, in sort of a shallow 1 to 2 foot inundation depth basin, is fairly high. It starts to drop down in the fall. It's lost due to freeze and thaw in spring, through the winter and spring. So our thought is, and how these systems work, is basically farming cattails to remove phosphorus. So as phosphorus grows and are taken up into the plants in the summer, in the fall, sort of late September, early October, and the timing is critical. These areas are drained, and then folks go into those and harvest that biomass to remove the phosphorus and get it off-site and out of the watershed. They're making, I guess, fuel pellets with the material in Manitoba, or using it as bedding for cattle, or simply spreading it across crop fields that are outside of the typical flooding area. So not too many farmers want to grow cattails. So this was a little bit of a sell to folks. You can guess on the sponsors, but they also saw the value. There was a project in Minnesota that was done several years ago. And this is kind of what it looked like. Folks really had the desire to continue to farm the bottom of these dry dams that we're building for retention. And in this case, they sort of made a compromise. They farmed some of the cells in some years, and some of the cells they utilized for basically this cattail growing to remove phosphorus. There was a ton of monitoring and research done on this particular project for 3 years. That's really been our best source of data. And they showed that in this fairly large agriculturally dominated drainage area of 75 square miles, they would have been able to remove 100% of the incoming dissolved phosphorus with this methodology over the 3 years at a ratio of about 4 acres of biomass harvest cell to 1 square mile of drainage area. And they did have issues with harvesting because they didn't have drainage set up to be able to get in there at just the right time. And of course, our sponsors would like to grow and harvest something that is more valuable than cattails. So that is definitely a concern. And up in Manitoba, where they're able to use this material for bedding, we don't have nearly the amount of animal agriculture on the U.S. side of the border in the basin. And so trying to figure out a utilization source for the bales is also a challenge. But that is the road we're headed down with many of the projects in terms of water quality. It certainly shows our commitment as a country and as organizations on the U.S. side to trying to address the phosphorus challenge. Not sure what's going on here. This is the project we've been talking about, the North Branch Cart Creek. So there's a channel there that basically there'll be a sheet pile weir in the channel. So flows above the 2-year or above bankful basically will be routed into a diversion channel and will be spread out onto the bottom of this area, this dry dam. They'll first be routing into the cell that we're calling basically, this is our 4 acres to 1 square mile of drainage area biomass harvesting cell. And you can see we're going to set up tile drainage under that, as well as a pump station, just like you would in a tile drained farm field, to ensure that we can remove water in the fall to get in there to harvest. And so we do that, and we're like, okay, there's quite a bit of area left here. What can we do to maximize the environmental quality benefits of that area? And that came to another one of the RCPP goals, which was to improve wildlife habitat. So in most of these areas, there are, oh, I'm sorry. I think I'm running a little short on time here, but I was going to go through some how we quantified phosphorus reductions. We basically used that Minnesota project as an example. If my slides would advance faster, we could zip on through this. Here's an example from another project even where we've created a bunch of pothole wetlands in the area that's not in the biomass harvesting area. And then we also remeandered a previously straightened stream channel to restore riparian wetlands. We're basically looking at sort of a kind of a full-scale attempt to maximize the environmental benefits of the project. So that really leads you to, okay, we have a cost benefit ratio in terms of dollars. How do we quantify these benefits? So we quantified the phosphorus benefits in terms of pounds of phosphorus reduced from the project, which we know is essentially all of the project from the incoming drainage area in a typical year. We used the hydrogeomorphic model we have available in North Dakota to estimate the wildlife benefits. And there's a full scoring system for that. And then when we sit down and evaluate one project against another, we, this is what the tables and the plans look like. We identify those monetary benefits, or those non-monetized benefits of the environmental quality account. And then we describe in the other social effects account what those international treaty benefits are, as well as the regional water resource plans. And then when we sit down and we take a look, project by project, here are just some examples from some preliminary numbers for the projects. And we say, okay, what are we getting? What are we paying here for these environmental benefits? $140,000 an acre for wetlands doesn't sound so good. That's why that's showing in red. 9,000 acres for wetlands. That sounds pretty good when combined with the phosphorus reduction. So we went sort of back and forth through these projects and looked at the ones that didn't look good comparatively. We kind of went back to the drawing board and said, hey, should we expand the scope of this project? Can we get more benefits out of it to really justify the taxpayer investment in the project? Now it's difficult to compare the dissolved phosphorus removals because you can only remove with a project what's coming in. So it does have to do with the amount of cropland upstream, to the extent to which a project can have a benefit. But that's sort of the approach we took. I'm winding up here. So I guess lessons learned. The PL 566 framework did allow for this integrated approach to meet the multiple objectives. The headquarters, Jimmy did approve our NED exception request for this North Branch Park project. And we anticipate if we have similarly high quality projects that we'll be able to get approval for that in the future. And as we convert to PRNG on new projects, that exception approval shouldn't even be required. Those localized flood damage reduction monetized benefits alone may not be adequate as far as NRCS is concerned as we're looking at the projects, but they're what is going to drive public support and the local sponsor willingness to implement. It's sort of the tragedy of the commons issue with water quality. It's hard to get any one entity to want to tackle a problem that's really a downstream problem. In this case, it's not even within our own country. But being able to move forward with these flood control projects basically provides incentive to maybe do something that will actually have a benefit towards that phosphorus problem, which is heartening to see. So I guess I will stop there.
Christi, thanks so much for that well-prepared program. Kate, Zach, same. Let me loop back with you each though, just in case you wanted to cover something that, oh my gosh, you got a few folks here on the line. If you want to something about the project or something you wanted to just emphasize. And let's start with you, Kate, and I'll come to you, Zach.
Well, we're running short on time, so I'll keep it short, but I'll just emphasize what Christy said last there. We're really looking forward to the PR&G process, making some of these environmental and social benefits, sort of elevating those in the watershed planning process.
Thank you. And Zach, and you've got a couple questions there too. If you want to take a swing at them, typing an answer, that would be great too. Something about the 100 years of drainage before and that sort of thing, kind of taking it at that level and beyond. And then one on the, gosh, an acronym I'm not familiar with, but I bet you guys are, HECWAT. And they said, thanks for that. And don't know if the agricultural conservation planning framework would help you with your work on agricultural runoff solutions. So there's just kind of a tip there. So, okay, Zach, last words?
I think I'd just echo what Kate had to say there. You know, I think looking forward to kind of some flexibility that PR&G may allow for these projects. You know, what we found was from looking at just strictly flood damage reduction benefit cost analysis within the planning watershed, these projects were kind of, they were hard to kind of get above the scale of one, I guess. But you know, there is a pretty there's a large local desire to kind of develop these type of projects. So being able to think outside the box and really do a good job of capturing all the benefits, I think is really important moving forward, like Christy discussed. So.
Well, you guys did an excellent job covering that from oh, we can't do it to we can do it. And hey, there is quite a lot of benefit here. That's quite a storyline, right? That you presented to us today. And we so appreciate you for several things. One, the preparation you put into this and the presentation you gave today. Thanks so much. And like I say, Zach, Christy, and Kate, if you want to take a swing at those two open questions there, we would do that while we're closing our session here today.